We'll take 3 or 4 questions at a time.
Thank you to both of you for your enlightening words. The first thing I would like to say is, and this will lead to the question is, right-wing populism is linked infinitely to religious fanaticism everywhere that it has prospered in the world. Now my question is, religion by its very essence presents a sort of supra-common sense, a sacred sense that is not common by definition. That is why it is special, it is divine, it is sublime, it is above what we can generally imagine and think. So how does right-wing bring together the populist, massy common sense and the sacred sense of religion that is linked to a few prophets, a few rishis, a few gurus, and is by its very extent something that has very small sources and is to be just imbibed by the rest? That was my question. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for this discussion. As clear from Ajay sir's yours discussion, it seems there is just not one common sense. Rather, I mean, if we talk about the social locations of the caste, you know, it's clear like there are common senses, I will say. And relating to what Amir sir has, like, you know, zoomed on Trump's common sense, you know, Melonies and all that, you know. I mean, Obama also, like, you know, I mean, did it in a very sophisticated manner, you know, and he has his forces, like, all over, but nobody has kind of, you know, talked about it. I mean, I wanted to understand, like, you know, when the rightest common sense that you ask, you know, for a person from the marginalized this thing, you know, it is not this common sense, but there are many, like, with elitist and privilege and all that, like, I mean, how to navigate that, like, you know, to understand that and not to kind of, you know, just like, you know, I mean, how academics can help us, like students, you know, not to get, you know, stuck into that rightist common sense, you know.
Vanakkam, Professor Ajay Gudavarthy and Professor Amir Ali. Professor Ajay Gudavarthy, I like the entirety of your talk except for the last part where you mentioned about Gandhi and friendships. So, in the campus we see friendships getting toxic and friendships getting broken down. Say for example, party A and party B. So we all know what we're talking about. So how do you ensure? How do you ensure friendships you know, they are aligned towards a common goal and don't bicker against one another, against a common enemy? And I wanted to make another point also. In your class, you teach about lay normativity by Andrew Sawyer. How do you differentiate the common sense that you mentioned in your speech from the Andrew Sawyer's lay normativity? How do you delineate the differences between both? And for Professor Amir Ali, I just wanted to make another point on pink washing, which is done by Zionist regimes and also by the West, where they make queer people, LGBT people, as a you know, victim of Hamas and all the Islamist organization, and they use Islamophobia and they use LGBT rights and Islamophobia to legitimize their occupation and their violence. So, how do you address pink washing and you know, used by the Western Zionist forces as common sense in the West against Palestinian rights? Thank you.
I wanted to ask the last question. I want to ask, you said about the common sense, the elites that they have social privilege, they do protests and all, and the larger common sense, they believe in making negotiations with the regime. So how is it like? How can the common sense believe that they have certain negotiations to make with the current BJP regime and not with the other regime, who is also, I mean, in terms of social benefits, they also keep promising the same.
Amir, you want to go first? You go first. Okay, thanks for these great questions.
the first question on religious, Gramsci has something to say on this. He says there are multiple forms that common sense takes, and he says religious common sense is one of them. That religion does not remain in terms of those holy sacred books, right? That religion becomes part of our everyday lived reality. It becomes part of the folklore, it becomes part of the folkish nature of the politics, it becomes part of the life world. So the way we make sense of reality, in fact, religion is a very powerful. So I don't think there's much of a question there that populists are able to use that form of religious connotations, religious symbolism with this ugliness of unruly populist mobilization. So there is actually one of the much easiest equivalencies in terms of religious common sense and populist mobilization. And to Shubhi's question, I don't know, I think you are struggling to make a point, but in terms of, this role, I will link your question to what Amir said in terms of the role of intellectuals. Now, that's the key part we are all struggling with, because certain forms of political philosophy have alerted us to this high pedestal role of intellectuals that should we really give. Michel Foucault was one of them who, in his piece on public intellectual, he knocks down this idea that why should somebody stand on high pedestal and then comment without belonging to that life world. Gramsci, on the other hand, gives an elevated position to intellectuals. He feels that intellectuals are capable of drawing a more systematic critical thinking from fragmentary thought processes. So this is a very tricky question that, what does this kind of unitary forms, Gramsci does believe that knowledge needs to have some unitary systemic mode of thinking to make it critical. But that if it comes with certain class that we attach as intellectual class, Marxism is replete with this debate on the intellectual class. Is it a class in itself? What is its public role, so on and so forth. But I would tend to disagree with both Gramsci and Foucault. I think both knocking it down as well as holding high pedestal for intellectual. I think we need to revisit this question of what does popular opinion, how do we draw an equivalence with a social transformation. I think there are enough clues within popular mobilization itself whether intellectuals can play this kind of an elevated role, especially in the current context, looks like a very suspect case. Who else can replace it? These are all very intricate debates. I'll not get into all of them here. The third question was, Appu, your question was, what was your question? As usual, I forget your question.
The last part, Gandhi's friendship part, he disagreed with.
Gandhi's friendship part, what is your disagreement?
They keep forgetting the principle.
So that's the process, that's the problem with the common sense, right? That fragmentary thought that Gramsci referred to is visible in this left versus Dalit conflict. So that's an ideal place I think one should begin with, where I think a new social form has to be experimented, where we continue to have our differences. Obviously the point that Dalit Bahujan politics makes in terms of the social privileges that left caste Hindu come from, I think is a very valid point. But does that demand a complete collapse and treat left like an enemy? I think that's an unwarranted extension. I think that clues exist in Ambedkar's own life. Ambedkar and Gandhi never saw eye to eye. Ambedkar had severe differences with Nehru, but went back to work with the Congress. Why? And Ambedkar is one philosopher who, in spite of talking about caste differences, always talked about idea of cultural unity, also idea of fraternity. Why did Ambedkar emphasize? And you talk about friendships, but Ambedkar ends up with Maitri in Buddhism. Why? So no political philosophy that is transformative cannot but talk about solidarity. Justice as solidarity, I think, is, from justice as fairness, we'll have to move to justice as solidarity. That we will have to reinvent, along with our differences, questioning each other's social privileges. Because people who question that social privilege should remember they themselves would have some kind of a social privilege. It is not possible that they are not. So, questioning oppression would mean questioning a part of ourselves. We'll have to question, because we are all carriers of some form of privilege. Either it is gender, either it is caste, either it is class, either it is regional, either it is urban location. So this ethic of questioning ourselves, I think most of the mass movements, this political mobilization, what they do is that they circumvent that question. No, they do not want to be questioned themselves, but want to singularly focus, by taking a singular locationality of victimhood. That, I think, is where we are in a class also dealing with deconstructive politics. And your later question in terms of lay normativity of Andrew Sayers. So if you remember, Sayers also talks about lay normativity is contingent and very, very contextual, that it can slip both ways. It is very inconsistent. So I think it goes with Gramscian reading, that life world itself. Susan Sontag has a very interesting point on this. She says in terms of language, she says people who cohabit in large collectives and in communities have very simple thoughts and simple language. She says that this extension of complexities is an act in solitude. Only when all of us sit in solitude, continuously ruminate and think, then you come out with more complex sensibilities. So this sense of, all this, what it suggests is that we cannot completely dismiss this everydayness of life. The question is that it always does not align with. That's what the right has understood. That it is taking that form seriously, projecting it onto the all existing forms of power relations, but reimposing a higher form of submission. Left and other progressive forces should be able to call out this bluff without being dismissive of life world forms. That is the new language that can only come if you reinvent social world, reinvent a new form of solidarity. That concrete imagination, unless you don't have, I don't think this exercise is possible. What is your question?
How does the people who have general common sense, how do they expect to make negotiations with the current regime and not with the other political parties that offer similar promises?
The point is this, that I think neoliberalism, when we say that negotiations are part of common sense, I think it should not miss a larger structural question. I think neoliberalism is also making it simply impossible for the subaltern to make anything other than contextually negotiated choices. I think their very mode of existence is dependent on these contextual negotiations. So one should not valorize them, but one should contextualize them. But one should also realize that perhaps the system is disallowing them any other form of political action. That's one reason why I think also street politics are, on the wane, is that neoliberalism really pushes people on the back. And that's also the other part that the right-wing populists try to make this the new common sense. That it is more intelligent to just negotiate rather than pay cost, by sacrificing. That all that old idealism looks, foolish for the new populists. So I think there's also a neoliberal context in which this is looking like more real, more practical, more pragmatic for the subalterns. So without missing that, one should grapple with this question.
Okay, thanks. Ritvik, your question about religion, its elevation, its divinity, the heights at which it exists. I can answer it by contrasting it with the kind of banality of politics, the everydayness of it. And there's always the attempt on the part of certain political groups to try to capture that element of divinized elevation in the everydayness. And I think this is where the state becomes very important. Because somehow there are certain proponents of a particular kind of politics who feel that the capture of state power will be able to let them do something, to be able to transform the banality of the everyday and give it a certain kind of elevation and divinity that only religion has. So nationalism, for example, is a pretty good example of this. Now, my only response to this is, since we're talking about so much about common sense, is that it would be very important to be able to develop some kind of a secular common sense. Now, there was a secular common sense in this country. Now, I accept that it was a secular common sense that did not pervade down to the level of what we call the grassroots. What we would call the Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb, who had a certainly kind of elitist commingling of communities to it. Now, the failure of that to reach down, which it existed, there was a lived experience to it. But that lived experience has so easily been infiltrated and sullied and adulterated by the kind of propaganda campaigns of religious organizations, both of the Hindu communalism and Muslim communalism, which convinces them that the only way to rise above the everydayness of their lives is to appeal to some kind of elevation of religion. And that aspect has to be challenged somehow. I mean, I can see the point of your question, and the juxtaposing of that, and to think about evolving a secular common sense is perhaps the only way to contend with this kind of situation. Okay. The question of pink washing, yeah, I'm aware of this particular problem. Let me answer that question by going back to a movie that came out called Aligarh. Okay, this was about a faculty member in Aligarh, a man called Ramchandra Silas, who was in a homosexual relationship. Now, the point that this came out, I think, 10 years ago, and the point that many people made was that quite often the particular kinds of sexual identity are used to put especially oppressed religious groups on the back foot. Now, I can see that happening. Now, the only way that I can answer that question is to look at the way that Trump won the election, the way that LGBTQ rights were discredited there. Now, it's the same political force that is using it, the same political force that is instrumentally using LGBTQ rights to put Palestine on the back foot, is also using the same rights to kind of elect the manliness and masochism of Trump. And that particular conflict is, I think, what we need to focus on to prevent this kind of pink washing, as you call it. And I can see the crude instrumentality of that. So that would be my response. I hope that answers the question. Okay.
Are there any more questions? So my question is regarding the relationship between common sense and hypocrisy, where often through populist leaders they make hypocrite claims and people are not able to see through it, or they don't want to see through it. So then the question is that through the strategic use of common sense to mask contradictions within like what populist leaders claim and do, how does the right manage the contradictions emerging within the common sense itself? And while the left liberals have been unable to do so, they become in fact at the receiving end that they're always hypocrite, or they just cannot win at any cost. So then how does the right really manage to see these contradictory elements within common sense itself?
Anyone else has a question?
You go first. The only thing, Sanjana, I can say is that we have something called the media. And the media is one of the biggest, how does one put this? The odds are so completely stacked against any kind of sensible, progressive left-wing opinion. And a lot of the common sense right now is being said by the media. Now, it is a losing battle because what I have noticed is that from the 1980s and 1990s, the Rupert Murdochization of the media has now given rise to the Elon Muskization of X, Twitter, and this. Now, this is so all-pervasive. It so completely saturates the whole environment that it's always a losing battle. You know, by the time you begin to contend with it, something else has been thrown at you. Now, how does one respond to this? I am completely clueless. But the larger mediatization of politics as a whole, I think, is the biggest way in which the odds are stacked in favor of a particular kind of common sense. And the common sense of decency or correctness just falls by the wayside. One way of doing it is by appealing to the truth. Because, as you said, hypocrisy is a very important forte of right-wing populists. I mean, I may be wrong. I perhaps am now, growing old and old-fashioned. I've always slightly been, but I do believe that an appeal to the truth will have a certain kind of purchase that would be able to overcome the insanity of such forms of hypocrisy and common sense. And I think somewhere all those old ideas of postmodernism and the truth as a construct have really harmed the cause of a simple appeal to the truth. And I think that, it's Orwell saying that in times of deception, telling the truth becomes a revolutionary act. And I think we are living in such times. So it would be important to go back to such simple, basic things as just trying to tell the truth, or just saying something that is wrong. And that might be the beginning of the battle that we have to try to win, but we may just lose.
So, okay, we keep discussing, but the only thing I would say is that I think right really manifests itself in those inconsistencies. That left believes in a transformative process, therefore thinks you need a systematic. But I think right allows those contradictions to play out. those things that cancel out each other, right? Fundamentally things that enables their conservative project. So right therefore has no problem with being inconsistent, with being self-cancelling, and therefore they do not see it as being hypocritical. They believe it as one form in which life world we live. And for matter of fact, we are all inconsistent in our everyday life. We say things we never do, we do things that we never state. So I think there is that fundamental inconsistency in life world form. And that's what is potentially, very attractive about what right does. But because in being, that self-contradictory outright, they look a lot more authentic to common sense. So that is their strength. And how they turn it to a conservative project, what do they do? Something common sense hurts their interest is all a very long, big story of how they kind of keep re-signifying that. We'll close it with this.
Since there are no more questions.